Chapter 7 Partings. Mahala's bell tolled in the Havamerian camp and sounded out across the city. Halrith, even with his mortal wound, had been the first to cross the finish during the race. The bell, however, did not sound with the ring of victory, but with long tolls of sorrow that echoed the mourning of the people. It was tolling when Arcos emerged from the Underhollow, when he came to the marketplace where the wreckages of merchant carts cast strange shadows in the weak light of the sinking moon. He crossed over to the library, over the broken wares that lay strewn about on the cobbles. Throughout the marketplace, imposts and a few stray jags scavenged the ruined food that spilled out of broken carts. The imposts scurried away from their pickings as Arcos passed, slithering their scaly bodies into the nooks and crannies of destroyed timbers. When Arcos came to the foot of the library, he started turning over the debris in search of something. Blood from Halrith's paw wound speckled the ground nearby, a sign that what he was looking for was near. He turned over a broken cart door, and as he did so, something underneath it caught the faint moonlight, something silvery. Picking up his carving knife, he returned it to its sheath on his belt. Arcos returned to his shop and lit the candles inside. Once the soft glow illuminated his shop, he sat down beside the Colossaurus rib and continued to etch out the story of the Mahala War. As he began to work, the flames on the candles cried out in wonder at their new existence, marvelling at all the things around them. They soon wanted to jump to the shelves, the door, the rafters, anything wooden, to create stronger light and heat. They called and called to Arcos, but he set about his work without paying them much heed. At length he said, "A little water drips from the jar in back," and the candles were silenced. Arcos's depiction of the Mahala War was nearly finished. There were Draymorns laying siege to Tierion, and there was Mahala charging down the hills with his men, the famed bell in hand. Using a small chisel and mallet, Arcos worked on the lower end of the rib and began to etch two figures caught on the battlefield. The entire story's flow down the rib seemed to culminate at where these two were placed. One was a woman slain, her sabres fallen at her side. The other was a bloodied man kneeling over her body, his mouth opened in an anguished cry. He very much resembled Arcos. It was dawn when the carving was completed. The candles had burned out, and sunlight shone through the chinks in the shutters. Arcos gently etched the closed eyelids of the slain woman, and her face was then finished. Compared to the desperate man above her, she appeared serene, lying on the battlefield as if asleep. Arcos leaned back to look upon his work and took the blue stone from the pouch on his belt so that it too could observe the carving. "Osira," he exhaled, looking at the slain woman, "what disappointment you would have if you could see me as I am now." The stone did not comprehend what it was that Arcos felt. Arcos was whole and did not bleed, yet still he felt pain. Long ago the stone had asked what this pain was, and Arcos had compared it to the fires that burned deep underground. The stone had then asked why Arcos chose to remember things that made him feel that way. Pain, he had explained, showed him that he still had a heart, that he was still a legender. He would have been like the bones if he forgot his pain. Centuries had passed since Arcos had given his answer, but the blue stone never forgot it, for stones remembered everything. "She is gone," Arcos said, still gazing upon the carving. "She is gone, and I need to rid myself of these walls." If Halrith had died in Havamere, the people would have bound him in elegant chains of Cormantle and adorned him with treasures of the kingdom. After his body was prepared, they would have sailed him far beyond the fishing waters and sent him overboard. The depths would have received him, and he would have become a part of the ocean. It was a funeral for an Erethier, a king, or a man with titles. But Hallerith had died far from the ocean, whether by wagon or by riverboat. His body would suffer great corruption if it were sent on the long journey back to Havamere. Maris voiced her desire for Hallerith to be put on a pyre, so that his ashes could be scattered on the ocean, but Rain Coracle and Rain Garifin advised against doing so. "It is not wise to swing a staff in a potter's house," Coracle stated. "Tierion sees the burning of the dead as a pagan and savage thing, and it would give them great offence. We also do not want them to mark you as the queen of a wild people, nor do we want Hallerith's funeral to be a time when foreigners come to mock us." "I too thought a burial would disturb his spirit," said Garifin. "But did not Mir bury Kilios under a pile of stones? Do not be troubled, my queen. Hallerith will find rest here in Tierion." Maris conceded. Havamere was given a glade in the gardens to use as a burial site, so the Fisher and Lowen men moved Hallerith's body there atop rolling logs, the same method they used to move ships to and from the shore. They laid Hallerith's body in the glade and built a tent up around him so that the gravers would not spot him from above and fly in foreboding circles. Once the body was in place, Mataro the Broken took up his spade and began to dig the grave. As the man in tatters cut away at the topsoil, Maris left her people and headed towards the base of the Averhorn, where the king of Tierion dwelled. Maris sat aboard her litter with 4 menservants carrying her up the steep streets of the city and with guards walking alongside. As they neared the Averhorn, it appeared that it was leaning more and more in their direction, ready to fall on top of them. Maris opened the curtain to her litter and stared at the tower, for she had never seen any structure like it before. There were veins of earth marrow's colour striping its sides, deep blues and greens, burnt yellows and oranges, a sign that the Averhorn had been hewn from a mountain long, long ago. Waterfalls rushed from the Averhorn's sides, and turrets perched along its heights. Gigantic columns spiralled upwards, rising higher and higher until they came to 4 monoliths at the top. Each monolith was glazed with ice, a testament to the Averhorn's great height. The men-servants carried Maris across a bridge over a ravine and came to the outer wall of Averut, the dwelling of Tierion's king. Though it was carved into the base of the grand tower, Averut's entrance held a commanding view of the city's southern half, for it sat atop a wide ledge on Tierion's hill. The gates of the outer wall opened for Maris's litter, and the men-servants carried her into a round courtyard where there grew scores of trees, green and laden with fruit. The way into Averut had no doors, but opened like a rounded cavern mouth. Intricate patterns of tracery ran along the walls of the opening, much like tree roots tunneling into the ground. A cascade fell from high above and crashed onto the eaves that stuck out over the opening, but the eaves came to a peak and split the cascade in two so that water flowed down both sides of the courtyard. Hundreds of opalias shimmered with white and silver along the stone path that led up to Averut's entrance. The flowers grew only on Mount Sedacia, and did not survive anywhere else for very long, but they had been planted for Mahala, and would last the 30 days of the festival. The constant misting of the cascade kept them well watered. There were statues all around the courtyard as well. Men and women, each many stories tall, were made to look as though they were clad in leaves and vines. The men braced their backs and brawny arms against the walls as if the Averhorn would collapse if they faltered. The stone women stood by the men and vigilantly watched different points of the southern horizon. In the very centre of the courtyard stood the tallest statue of them all. It was the figure of Avaleo, the right hand of Ahatho. At his base, creatures of strange elemental shapes encircled him and snarled at him. Avaleo looked down at them, and held aloft a stone replication of his famous sword, the Earthedge of Dawn. As Maris stepped out from her litter, she stared and stared at all that surrounded her, but it was Avaleo's statue that entranced her the most. She found the expression on his face so truly fearless, yet so pained, that it seemed a living being had hardened into stone. "Surely Ahatho crafted this place," Maris whispered to herself. Maris left her escorts in the courtyard and came to the opening where there stood a company of guards. They wore dark green capes that fell to their feet and breastplates with polished earth-marrow stones worked into the metal. Their helms covered most of the face so that only the eyes showed. "I have come to speak with the king," Maris said when she stood before them. Without a word, a pair of guards bowed and led her into the Ehredt. They went down a long hall lined with statues holding up the ceiling. It would have been a dark hall had it not been for the shafts of sunlight that shone through the tunnels above. Maris and the guards walked in silence with only a soft rumbling coming from the walls and floor, the sound of water surging up from wells deep underground. Other passageways diverged from the hall, some wide and others narrow, but the guards continued going straight and led her to where the hall widened and came to the pair of tall doors. The guards opened the doors for her, and Maris entered alone. "Queen Maris Elamor of Havamere," one of the guards announced. Her name echoed in the throne room, and then the sound vanished, swallowed up by the vast space. The throne room had tall columns that looked like trees, each branching out before they reached the vaulted ceiling. Leaf designs were etched into the ceiling, and tracery appeared as branches interwoven with one another, the sunlight shining through the gaps. There were places where the tracery opened up wide, and large shafts of light came in as angled pillars. Mercius's throne stood atop a dais on the far end of the room. There the king sat with half a dozen men with books gathered around him. When he saw Maris enter, he sent the men away with a motion of his hand. Maris approached the throne and drew her speaking totem out from a pouch on her sash. It was a sphere with dark blue glaze and silvery monk shells. The teeth of her ancestors rattled inside with the trembling of her hand. When she came to the foot of the dais, she placed the totem in a bowl that lay before the first step. Mercius nodded to her, and Maris bowed. "She who greets the king greets good counsel and receives Ahatho's blessing," she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. Mercius called his servants, and they brought out an ornately carved chair for Maris to sit in and placed it before the throne. They also brought a jar of timber wine and served it to king and queen. After pouring libations to Ahatho, Mercius and Maris drank in silence. Only when their cups were empty did Mercius begin to speak. "Tell me why you have come." "I have come to plead for Hallerith's honour," she responded. "The vow of secrecy that prohibits us from speaking of Hallerith's slayer. Such a vow, though created in wisdom, will bring great ruin upon Hallerith's name. If my people do not learn of how he truly died, if they do not learn of the poison and the Draemon, they will think of Hallerith as a beast who filled his cup with rage and drank it of his own accord. He was no such beast, but a gentle creature. I ask of your permission to speak the truth to my people, so they will not think of him with tarnished thoughts." Mercius looked down on her, his face pensive. "I hear your words," he responded, "and what you say is true, but my command will remain. We must make such sacrifices for that which is greater than ourselves and our personal desires. The people cannot learn of the Draemons, not yet, for it would bring them great fear. Remember that it was fear that fed Dakor, and fear would feed many wicked things if it were let out among the nations." "So I am to abandon the defence of Hallerith's name?" Mercius gave a heavy sigh and picked up a small wooden box from a small stand beside his throne. He held it out to Morris. "Take this," he commanded. Morris rose from her seat and cautiously ascended the dais. She gingerly took the box from Mercius's hand and quickly returned to her chair. When she opened the box, she saw an arrowhead inside. There was dried blood and a black substance on it. "A time may come when you'll be able to restore Ehredt's honour," said Mercius. "But no one is certain of when that time will be. If it comes, you may tell your people the truth. Show them the dart with its poison, and it may placate any who are in disbelief, but only when the time comes. This is all I can offer you now." With that, Mercius bowed his head, a sign that Morris was dismissed. After the king's council in the Underhollow, word of the legender's existence quickly spread throughout Tierion. Down the streets and up the towers it was all that the people would talk about. This was not a tale or a myth, but a truth. A legender was alive and among them. There were those who were afraid, for they had heard of what the legender had done to Havamir's Erethia at the city gate. But there were also those who held a childlike awe and fascination, and these people came to gather in the front of Arcos's shop without fear. First there were dozens, then hundreds, then over 1,000 crammed into the dingy corner of the marketplace where his shop stood, while most had come just to see the legender and look upon a breathing relic. Some were there because they desired to be his disciples and followers. The most zealous of them pressed against the shop, knocking on the door and shutters. An hour would pass, and then another, but they would receive no reply. "I saw him enter early this morning," someone asserted. "I've been watching this door ever since, and he has not left. He must be in there." "But why does he not answer us?" another questioned. "Is this a test of our patience?" Although Arcos did not come out at their beckoning, the crowd continued to swell and push against the shop door. The bolt that kept the door locked groaned against the pressure and eventually broke from its hold with a crack. The door made a mad swing inward, and a mound of people tumbled into the shop. To their surprise, it was empty. The legender was not to be found. Even the carvings and old weapons were gone. All the shelves were bare, and all that could be found was an empty coffer in the back of the shop and a wilting bouquet of opalias lying on the table. The crowd dispersed. Many grumbled in disappointment, yet there were others who felt even more amazed than they had before, for the legender had somehow made himself disappear. The shop had been searched, and the stones in the walls and floor had been checked to see if any were loose and hid a secret hollow or passage. All the stones had held firmly to their places, just as Arcos had asked them to. Before the crowd had gathered, Arcos knew that unwanted attention would come his way, so before it did, he had the blue stone from the pouch on his belt create an opening in the floor of his shop. The opening went down to a small underground chamber. It was there he stored all of his carvings and old weapons. A tunnel ran from the chamber to other deep places under Tierion, but Arcos did not worry about his collection ever being found. In the long dark years he had been set to watch over the old king's tombs. He had never seen anyone wandering in this region of tunnels. There his collection would sit until he returned. He did not know when, nor did he care to think of it. 2 pieces from his collection, however, would go with him on his journey. The 2 sabres that had been on the sign to his shop. He spoke their names when their handles made themselves at home once again in the palms of his hands. Ara he called the one in his right, and Tol the one in his left. Both of you may soon be needed. It took 3 days for Mataro the Broken to dig Ehredt's grave. A small crowd had gathered around the widening hole. they silently watched as Mataro went deeper into the ground. As he tossed up soil, the mound he made grew higher and higher. He passed through layers of different-coloured soils, black, orange, and grey, and unearthed large rocks of earth marrow. The sweat and dirt turned to mud on his naked chest and back. Though his old bones made him slow, he worked all the hours of the sun. By evening of the third day, he finished the grave. The Lowen women had prepared Halerith's body for burial, cleaning off the dust and odour of blood. They had rubbed oils and sweet-smelling spices into his fur and skin, so as to keep corruption at bay. Once the ground was open and the body prepared, it took over a score of men and many ropes to lower Halerith neatly to the bottom of the grave. They positioned him so that he was curled up, and it looked as though he was sleeping. As twilight dimmed and turned into night, the Havamirians built tall bonfires to give light to their wake. Maris took her place on a seat prepared for her on the edge of Halerith's grave. Beside her stood a priest from the temple of Tierion, and he spoke to all of the Havamirians gathered there. Sympathizers from other nations stood on the fringes of the crowd. The priest spoke some words over Halerith's body and led the people in a long prayer to Ahatho. Maris could hardly pay attention to what was said. She instead thought of the morning a few days before when she sat on the riverbank with Halerith. She longed to go back to that time, yet no matter how close it seemed, it was gone. A fit of grief struck her, and she buried her face in her hands. After the priest finished speaking, he sprinkled water from the Asetsi River onto Halerith's body. The people deemed this a good ritual, for the river fed into the ocean that surrounded Havamir. The musicians then began to play mournful songs on their flutes and drums, and singers added their voices to make elegies. One by one the Havamirians dropped what treasures they possessed into Halerith's grave. Jewelry made from salt gems and rich outer robes of Tyrrek hides piled up around Halerith's body. Casks of timber wine were opened, gifts from the king of Tercia to show his condolences. Trishans, fishers, and Lowens drank together, for all, whether rich or poor, had been reduced to humble clothing and appearance. As the drink flowed, the drums and flutes began to quicken, and the Lowen men and women heeded the music's call. With grim faces they began to dance in the glade. Since these poor had not placed treasures of great value around Halerith's body, they paid with sweat their tribute to the dead. The men deftly stomped against the grass, and the women swayed this way and that, reaching out with their arms toward the grave. The rising of the moon over the trees intensified the fervour, for the moon was nearly full and cast a strong, pale light upon the glade. The drums and flutes quickened even more. The women wailed, and some of the men tore branches from the trees and beat them against the ground. It was a fierce dance of grief. As the music was about to reach its climax, a group of Lowen women shrieked in fear. The music ceased, and the dancers halted. The women cried out, saying they had seen great shapes moving among the trees of the garden. They said that ghosts had come from the dead country to dance with the living, but their fears subsided when they saw that the great shapes were not ghosts, but the Ereathias from the other nations. The people at the wake watched as the creatures emerged from the trees. Coming to the open grave, the Ereathias sat along its edges and looked down at the body. Esu and Talagos sat on either side of Maris, but the queen did not turn to acknowledge them. She, along with the other Ereathias, concentrated fully on where Halerith lay. The last time the Ereathias had gathered around Halerith was when he had been very young. They had left their nations and flown to Havamir, responding to the mysterious sense that told them a cub had newly come to the lands of humankind. With secret words that only Ereathias knew, they had blessed the cub. As they sat by his grave, they quietly purred the secret words once more. The Ereatheers then raised their heads in unison, and howled woefully like the Lovos of the wild. The Ereatheers' cries sounded throughout the city, echoing off the towers and walls through the streets and alleys. The entire city stopped to listen. When the long howl finished, the Ereatheers gave one last look to Hallerith and left his graveside, disappearing back into the garden's shadows. Maris spoke up while all was quiet. "I would like to be alone with him." At her command, the instruments were put away and the casks of timber wine were sealed. The people left the glade and went back to their camp, while Heron and a small company of soldiers stayed to keep watch over their queen. They stood at a distance, gathered under the trees. Once the glade was clear, Maris left her seat and kneeled down at the very edge of the grave. "You flew so swiftly," she whispered, "and the bell is yours. You would have carried it back to Terracaste for all our people to see. It will sound in Havamere, but now it makes an empty sound. Oh, how can you leave me, Hallerith? You were to live for many more years, yet now I am left alone. Who will walk beside me? Mine is an empty path where there is no companion. How can you leave me now when they talk of war? How can I lead during such a time? The enemy will not show pity to women or the young, nor will our people show me pity if I lead them to destruction. Therefore I have made my decision. Just as the bell is empty, so will be my crown. I will give up my crown, for you are no longer with me." "Yet my speech is muddled," she said, shaking her head, "for I know that you will always be with me." She then took out a short piece of cord she had tucked into the sash on her waist. "I want you to have this." She placed the piece of cord into Hallerith's paw. "The other half is mine." Her fingers rubbed another piece of cord that was tied around her wrist as a bracelet. "I will never untie it, and it will go with me into my grave. Even now we are still connected." The last few words came out in a sob. Maris buried her head in her hands, hot tears wetting her palms. All through the night, Maris stayed at the graveside, and when the dawn came, Mahala's bell tolled in the Havamerian camp, a sign to all that they were leaving for home.